Welcome to the Craftsman Founder Podcast, hosted by Lucas Carlson. Every week, we talk to founders, entrepreneurs, and those who've made a craft out of creating companies and enterprises. Listen every week to get ideas for starting, promoting, and growing your business. There are no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned hard work and craft. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's interview.
Hey, welcome to this week's Craftsman Founder Podcast. I know it's been a little bit since we've done these recordings, but I wanted to, get started back into the groove again. And this week we've got a really great guest for you, Dr. Shawn Weiss, and he's come out with a really cool book that we're going to talk about knowing when to quit your job. When is it right to jump in and be an entrepreneur? And if you don't know who Dr. Shawn Weiss is, he's got an awesome background. He's a professor of entrepreneurship. Elliot's been friends with him for a while. Elliot, why don't you talk a little bit about your friendship with him?
Yeah, absolutely. Shawn's a phenomenal guy. He's one of the leading experts on entrepreneurship and innovation and venture investing in Canada. And I'm a dual citizen, so I'm my mom's from Vancouver, and so I have a selfish interest in also helping to support Canadian entrepreneurs. And so I was really excited to meet Shawn. We were connected initially last year because we actually share the same publisher, FG Press. So that's when I initially met him. He ended up being a fan of my novels and vice versa. I love his writing and his work. And he's just a wonderful, wonderful guy. He, as I think you just mentioned, he's a professor of entrepreneurship. He also helped start the Dragon's Den TV show, which is what Shark Tank was based on. And he has a new TV show now on Oprah's network about entrepreneurship called The Naked Entrepreneur, which you really don't want to see visually, but the show is great. So he's an all-around great guy. He's worked in the startup world for decades, and he knows as much about it as anyone.
Yeah. So before we get into that, what have you been up to, Elliot?
I feel like whenever me and Lucas talk about what we've been up to, it's like a roller coaster ride of different adventures. One thing that I found really interesting lately is I had a chat with Shawn's co-author on this book that we're about to talk about, Brad Feld, and he's a well-known venture investor in the U.S. And we were talking about reading because Lucas, you're a huge reader as well as being a writer. And I mean, I think I probably read about 100 books a year and write as well. And Brad's the same. He reads. I've actually never met a human being on earth that reads as fast as he does. I think he will go through a book a night if he's got a
I don't actually read that fast. I'm more like Ryan Holiday that reads pretty slow, but I just try to fit reading in all my parts of life. So it's like because I'm kind of all digital, which is not very common for big readers, but it makes it very easy because I can just pick up my phone and read a couple pages while I'm in line waiting to order food. And I'm not a fast reader, which surprises a lot of people. I just I read every time that there's a few minutes break.
So I'm actually exactly like you. And that's like opposite of Brad, right? Like I honestly don't understand how fast he could be in speed reading competitions.
Yeah.
But I'm just like you, and in fact, I'm like a multi-format reader.
Yeah.
So I always have a print book that I'm reading, a Kindle book that I'm reading, an audio book that I'm listening to, and a digital book that I'm reading on the Kindle app on my phone.
Interesting. See,
so I usually have like 4 books going on.
And so I have set a rule for myself that I won't read more than one fiction at a time or more than one nonfiction at a time, because when I do that, I never end up finishing books. Like when I used to go at 4, 5, 6 books at a time. And whatever was interesting at the time would grab me, and I'd never end up finishing almost anything. And so now with my rule, I get excited about a new book, and I can't get to it till I finish the one I'm working on.
There you go.
But like you, I do multi-format. What I do is, especially on the fiction stuff, I have the Kindle and an audiobook. So in the car, I'm listening to it, and it whisper syncs with the Kindle version. So when I pick up my Kindle,
Oh yeah, nice.
I like listening and reading at the same time, and it gives me different perspectives on the same work.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I just ever since I was a kid, I loved audiobooks. Speaking of Canada, my family would do road trips where we'd go I grew up in Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we'd drive up through Portland, where you're based, all the way up to Vancouver. And so that's basically 2 full days of driving in a car. And I would either convince them that they should listen to my audiobook like over the speaker system in the car, or I would bring like a Walkman, right? And like I'd go to the library here. They used to have like 8-track tapes, but for books on tape, right?
Yep.
And I think that there's something really interesting about listening to a story. It makes it sort of for me. It makes me think of like the original storytellers, right? Like we have oral traditions of Homer and many of the ancient classics were designed to be told, or not designed to be read.
Yep. What are you reading right now?
Right now, I just finished an audiobook that I highly recommend. It's called Station 11.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you've heard of it,
no.
But it won a number of awards last year. I can probably pull up the author right now. But Station 11 is really interesting. It's interesting because it's sort of, so the author is Emily St. John Mandel, Station 11. And I find it interesting because it sort of fits what has turned into a really recent trope, genre trope of just being post-apocalyptic, right? Yep. So, there have been so many stories in that vein in the past 5 years, from the Hunger Games to the Divergent series. Like there's clearly something about that kind of story that is resonating with the public imagination right now. But what's really interesting about Station 11 is that it's a literary novel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very readable, so it's not dense, but the characters are extremely well developed. It's a very human story, mm-hmm. and there's a lot of emotional depth to the whole book. So it's really interesting because it really makes you think, it makes you feel, and it's not just sort of like a fear-mongering roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
It's really insightful and introspective. So I actually really recommend it.
Nice. Yeah, right now I'm almost done with Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth, which is my fantastic nonfiction, and I'm absolutely loving it. I just finished Ken Follett's Laying Down with Lions, which is one of his older classics. It's interesting because Ken Follett, who's known for Pillars of the Earth, had a bunch of bestsellers that sold millions of copies in like the 80s and earlier. But they're all kind of forgotten now, and like nobody mm-hmm. reads them, nobody picks them up anymore, but they're just really, really good. And Laying Down with Lions is definitely in that list. The Eye of the Needle.
So that makes me think of something. Why do you think that is? Because there have been reverse stories of books that were out of print for many years, yeah. that then somehow find a renewed readership, right? Where they've sold 10 copies a month for 20 years, and then suddenly it's thousands of copies a month.
I wouldn't be surprised if this happens with Ken Follett. He's just such a good author.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe you're leading that trend.
Yeah.
Was there anything? Have you read Pillars of the Earth?
I'm just about to start on it.
Okay, so that'll be interesting to compare them, because that's definitely his most name brand work.
Yeah, and I've read a lot about Ken Follett, and what Ken Follett wanted to write Pillars of the Earth early on in his career, but he wasn't ready for it, and he knew it.
Oh, wow.
And so it's interesting for me to be reading his earlier work, because I think it's going to give me a different perspective on Pillars. Like I can see him flexing his muscles.
Mm-hmm.
and practicing kind of with some of his earlier bestsellers, and so it'll be interesting to track that, because he's talked about how he had to work his way up to those monster novels.
No, that's actually really interesting. That's really interesting.
And actually, one piece of news that I haven't really shared publicly yet is that I finished the first draft of my novel. So that's
awesome. Congratulations. That's huge. Yeah, that's huge.
So that's in production, in editing now. So it's going to be a little bit in editing, but it should be out this summer.
It's very exciting. Yep. Yeah, that's really exciting. And maybe we can, we'll have some fun co-launch activities, because absolutely. I'm in the process of finishing out my third novel, so awesome. It should be done in a couple weeks. Yeah, no, that's great. I'm really looking forward to reading yours.
And likewise, can't wait for the trilogy.
Yeah, for sure. Close it out, right?
Yep.
So one interesting thing that I heard about books from Brad, Sean's co-author, is that he often he's written a number of business nonfiction books about venture capital and about building businesses. And so I asked him, well, what are the books that you read the most and that you recommend the most to entrepreneurs? And his answer was sort of counterintuitive, especially given the books he's written and sort of what you would guess someone like him might recommend. Because the two things that he recommends most often are biographies and science or speculative fiction. So he doesn't recommend business advice books. In fact, he actively said, don't worry about those, right? Like read Einstein's biography or Thomas Jefferson's biography, right? Read Asimov, read so many, William Hertling with and some of the new sort of breed of techno thriller and near-term science fiction writers. Yeah, and
Hugh Howey with the Wool series is just a must read. If you pick up Hugh Howey's Wool and read the first 60 pages, like you're either not going to be able to stop reading for the next 1,500 pages, or you're just not into it.
Right, that's absolutely true. And actually, so Hugh Howey is famous for being an author entrepreneur. He's a self-published author, and he's been sort of the poster boy for that whole movement. And another self-published author whose book, or originally self-published, now he got bought up by a large publisher, but Andy Weir's The Martian is the novel that I recommend the most to entrepreneurs, because ostensibly it's about a NASA astronaut who gets stranded on Mars and has to survive, right? That's the premise. But it's the most interesting, readable engineer as protagonist that I've ever read.
Yeah.
And the resourcefulness of the main character is just so visceral, so awesome that that's the kind of resourcefulness entrepreneurs need to exhibit in order to make sure that their businesses find success. So
that book is next up after Pillars on my list.
Ooh, you're gonna love it.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, it's absolutely up your alley. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Well, that's sort of an interesting segue, because Sean and Brad's latest book, which we talked to Sean about here in this interview, it's called Startup Opportunities, and it's sort of like the primer for aspiring entrepreneurs. So Brad actually said recently that if you've read The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, that's the how. Right? Like, okay, you want to build a business. How do you do it? Read The Lean Startup.
Yeah.
And he framed Startup Opportunities as the why. So you should actually read Startup Opportunities before The Lean Startup to make sure that that's the business you want to start, and then go to Eric and he'll tell you how.
Cool. Well, let's get into the interview and see you next week.
Cheers.
Hello, this is Lucas Carlson.
Hi, this is Elliot Pepper.
And this is the Craftsman Founder Podcast. This week we've got a great guest for you, Dr. Sean Weiss. Now, Dr. Sean Weiss is an awesome guy, professor of entrepreneurship for Ryerson University Entrepreneurship Program, but he's also really cool. He's got his hands in a lot of really cool projects, many of which you've probably heard about, He's a consultant for the Dragon's Den, which is just like the Shark Tank. He creates a TV show called The Naked Entrepreneur TV, which is also on the Oprah Winfrey Network. So Oprah herself watches this program. And he's an author of a brand new book that launches today, Startup Opportunities, Know When to Quit Your Day Job. He's done lots of other stuff, and we'll get into some of that. But I'm really excited to have him on the program to learn more about things like when should you quit your day job and questions like that. So, Sean, thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. I was born very, very young. I like long walks on the beach. I'm an amateur astronaut, and I like collecting My Little Ponies. No, you really did me great justice. I've been an entrepreneur since I was 13 years old. As I got older, I got more into the venture capital business, and I spent the dot-com boom in New York and Web 2.0 on the West Coast. And I've really spent my life trying to help other people empower their lives with entrepreneurship.
So maybe we can hop right in, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about the topic of your book that launches today. We actually caught you at your book launch. So, the central question of today's conversation is really, if I've got an idea for a new business that I want to start, how do I make the decision to take the leap?
Well, I think that's a great starting point. So Brad and I wrote this book, Brad Feld, my co-author, from Techstars and Fitbit and Foundry Ventures and Mobius Ventures and Startup Weekend and Startup America and the Wall Street Journal. So he's a good co-author. And we get stopped almost every day, whether it's on Shark Tank or Dragon's Den or at school, and people want to know what we think of their idea, as if our blessing comes from on high and somehow makes the idea better or not better. And I guess I should dispel that myth. The first thing we talk about in the book is you really shouldn't care what I want. Yes, I'm an investor. Yes, I've been doing this for a long time. And yes, I wrote a book to help you better understand it. But really, you should focus on your customers, and that they're the ones who can tell you if what you're creating is worthwhile creating, if what you're doing is worth, going all in for, if this is the one you should be selling your children to science for. And all we tried to do was give people a little more than we could in 15 minutes when they just go, so what do you think of my idea? Because there's just no way to cover it all. And that's really what we wrote about in the book.
That makes a lot of sense. So I talk to lots of entrepreneurs, and they come to me with their ideas. Is there a process, a set of questions? How do you go around, or is there a heuristic for deciding? You say the customer tells you when it's time to quit your job. Is there any heuristic to that?
Well, in the 20th century, when Brad and I started venture capital, which would be for him 87 and for me 97, we would have a model, and we sort of go through a checklist. Is this the right founding team? Is this a big growing market? Is this product proprietary? But what's happened is the launching startups and new products has dropped so low that you can test an idea in the market for $50. You can create a landing page and show your product and say buy here, and it just goes to an email address or a Shopify store. So it's possible to test these ideas. So I don't want to take credit for this, but the heuristic or paradigm or the way we approach it is through the lean startup model, which Eric Ries is famous for explaining, or customer discovery model, which Steve Blank, who was one of my professors, really describes well, in that it's not for you in your parents' basement to think about the idea. It's to take it out to the market, to show it to the world, and to let the world's feedback guide you. Create that minimum viable product, that email. Remember, email became so popular, but it didn't have spell check. It didn't have font selection. You couldn't choose Times New Roman or Sans script. All it did was go from point A to point B lightning fast. And it was good enough. We didn't have a button to recall it if you were drunk when you sent the email. Now they do, but originally you didn't. But by having that and watching adoption and understanding your customers, that's what validates an idea. And the best thing about it is you don't have to quit your day job to do that.
So if the barrier to entry to starting a new company has now dropped so low, given the new
technological infrastructure that we can leverage when starting a startup. Why do people still ask you that question all the time?
Well, I think there's always a delay between academic knowledge, practitioner knowledge, and the general public. But I think the bigger question is, what I started to fund in '97 would cost me about $2 million to take to market. And by 2002, maybe it cost me $500,000 to take it to market. And now it's like $50,000, and I imagine in 5 years it'll be $5,000. So the barrier to entry isn't first to market, it's about execution. And it's about understanding how to build towards a value proposition and to make sure that you're serving your customer. And so yes, the barriers have dropped to nothing, but you can also scale infinitely fast. So in Canada, we've just had Show Me and Crave TV, which are Netflix knockoffs by the cable company. And the cable company is doing that because they don't know what else to do. They've already lost, 10, 20% of their customers to Netflix because they're charging $300 a month, and I get less entertainment out of my TV box than I get from Netflix for $9.99. And so economic evolution says these things just keep occurring until we find the best level. So maybe there's no barriers to entry, or maybe they're low now, but that just gives you a level playing field. You don't have to be with the silver spoon or have a rich uncle to give you friends and family money. You can just have a dream and a lot of hard work.
What are some of the common mistakes that entrepreneurs make when picking a startup idea?
Well, I think that the two that I see the most often in our students and in first-time founders is they try to solve problems that they don't have access to or knowledge of the industry. So let's say I think that 3D simulators are cool, and I think the best people to sell them to are surgeons in training, because that way you can work on a simulation. I wouldn't start that startup unless I had someone on my team who was a surgeon, who understood the training of surgeons, who understands how medical schools work. We made an investment 12 months ago in a company called Figure One, and Figure One is the Instagram for doctors. And every day, hundreds of thousands of doctors around the world put up photos of the most horrendous images that they're having trouble diagnosing. And other doctors, because they don't have any patient information, they're all HIPAA compliant, get to sort of weigh in. And it's the same thing they would do in their little hospital in North Bay, Ontario, except you have access to the world's knowledge. So is there a barrier to entry? I don't know. But if I had 500,000 doctors, I would consider that a barrier. And yet they started it as an idea on our campus. So the first thing that I find entrepreneurs tend to do wrong is they try to get into businesses they have no domain knowledge on. And I think the second thing they try to do is they don't think about the end goal. I started off as a lawyer, but when I realized that the only way lawyers make money is by working more hours, I realized that it would just keep going in circles. I could work 100 hours, but then I never have time to spend the money. It wasn't a scalable resource. So I always try to tell people they have to think bigger, but they have to think more scalable. They have to think of an ability to offer a solution that's exponentially better, but not just one, not just two, but 100,000 of them. Because it's the same amount of work to take a great startup to market as it is to take a dumb one.
When you were working on the book with Brad, was there anything that you two disagreed on when thinking about startup opportunities?
There was only one fundamental disagreement that I can remember, and it was whether or not we would call the book a tool for unicorn hunting. In the last 6 months, the meme, the meme, whatever you want to pronounce it, has been going on is that the startups are becoming unicorns, which means a company less than 5 years old that reaches over $1 billion in value. So the Ubers of the world, the Snapchats, the WhatsApp. And Brad really didn't like that idea because that is so rare. That is the 1 in a million. The majority of people don't work at startups. They work at SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. And they need to be able to evaluate whether this product or that product is what they should bring in. And whether that means they're at a dry cleaners and which service they should adopt, or they work in a convenience store and which Coca-Cola bottle company should you go with. And I think he's got a great point. And yet, in our day-to-day lives, as investors, we look for unicorns. But I think the thing that people make a mistake about is you only have to be worth $1 billion company if you have hundreds of millions of dollars of investor money. If you just start a business and it runs and does a few $1 million of revenue every year, and it pays you and your employees the mortgage money, and it keeps the lights on, well, then you're like 99% of America and 99% of Canada and probably England too. It's great to focus on startups, but the bread and butter of the economy isn't about unicorns. It's about you and me.
Well, it sounds like the silver lining of changing the title is also that you probably avoided some ire from animal rights groups. So keeping it real.
Well, I wanted the plural called unicorn hunting in the 21st century, but I think I'll make that my biography.
So how do entrepreneurs and investors see opportunities differently?
How do they see differently from normal human beings, or
from each other? So whereas an entrepreneur might think this is a fantastic idea, an investor might shy away from it. How do they differ?
Well, I think they differ in a very fundamental mental way. To be an entrepreneur, you have to be willing to work at 3 a.m. on your holiday. You have to be so passionate about the space that you'll read articles about the nuances of scientific development in your area. And as a result, you have to build your skin thick enough that you can have everyone tell you it's going to be a stupid idea and it's still going to be Star Wars. But the other side of that is you have to prevent yourself from developing willful blindness, where you can't see the flaws. The great entrepreneur has a sort of Zen-like balance between willful blindness and self-confidence, arrogance. And by doing so, the entrepreneur often struggles to be able to see the trees and the forest at the same time. An investor has that arm's length. An investor has heard 100 pitches this week while you've only given 5. And so it's kind of like you can be a manager of a hockey team or a baseball team and not be a good baseball player. But to be a good baseball player, you have to know something about the game. And so for me, entrepreneurs see opportunities as keys to future states, whereas investors see opportunities as return on investment.
A lot of the ideas in the book, actually all of the ideas in the book are really universal. They could be relevant to almost any entrepreneur in any place on earth. But one thing that's pretty interesting about you and your co-author Brad's background is that Brad's obviously been a venture capital investor in the U.S. for a long time, and you're based in Ontario. Are there any nuances that you've noticed between Canadian and American entrepreneurs, given that you work with them every day?
Are there any differences between American and Canadian entrepreneurs? Well, as a good Canadian, I'm going to start with an apology.
As a dual citizen, I'll accept it.
I'm not sure how brilliant I am about it. I've been in the venture capital business 15 years. Brad's coming up on 2022. There is some differences. Canadians tend to be less bombastic. They tend to be less aggressive salespeople. They tend to balance their try with their do, whereas my American friends tend to be very aggressive in their sales, very bombastic, no self-humility needed, very much more comfortable with self-promotion, and very much focused on doing, not trying. Brad and I always agree that try or try not, it's the do that matters, right? You either do something or you don't do it. Just trying isn't enough. And I find that that's a big difference. I think the other big difference between north and south of our border is in America, if you fail multiple times, they say you're waiting to succeed. In Canada, if you fail multiple times, they say you should run for government. And so there is a fundamental difference. The other things are very, very similar. Brad is sort of 10x me, and the U.S. is sort of 10 times the size of Canadian population. Apologize less and do more. But from an entrepreneurial perspective, I'm really pleased that you found the concepts to be universal because, like I say, maybe 1 in 100 people I meet are startups. 99 are entrepreneurs. And I think that the worst thing we can do, and one of the things I learned a lot working with Mr. Wonderful himself, Kevin O'Leary, who wrote a portion of the book, The Shark and Dragon, himself, was that you don't do anyone any favors by not being directly honest. And I think friends don't let friends do stupid startups. There are things that you should be able to do no matter what type of business you want to get into. And if you're more interested in execution and less on making a great plan that you're not going to be able to use, it's probably not the right way to go about it. And every day, people struggle with diets. And I always laugh because the issue with the diet isn't the decision to go on a diet. It's not the big decision. It's the little decision every day. And it's like entrepreneurship. It's not the big decision to be an entrepreneur, to launch a startup that matters. It's the getting up every day and doing the little things that in the end make you successful.
Makes sense. So one of your accolades is you actually won the National Mentor of the Year award, which is awesome.
I guess there weren't a lot of people applying that year.
So what's your best advice for entrepreneurs?
My best advice for entrepreneurs. I don't know. I have so many fortune cookie advices that I like to give out. I mean,
give us your top three.
My top three: do or do not. There is no try. Stop whining and start doing. Those are that's a pretty common one. We have an accelerator up here, like Techstars, that I work with, and that one they're pretty famous for knowing. I think people need to chase investors a lot less and customers a lot more. And the last one is that entrepreneurship is, in my eyes, the third hardest job in the world. And I think the only things that are harder are being a spouse and working together to make a family over a long period of time. I think that's a lot of work. And then, of course, being a parent, where your employees run wild and they pee on the carpet and they hate you for 5 years, and then they leave you to go to college, and then they move right back in. And so other than those two,
especially if they're an entrepreneur,
it's not your basement, Mom. It's my office. But the key really is that it's tough work, and it's a team sport. I've started 5 businesses. Brad started, I think, 3 or 4. If you don't even count Techstars and all the companies we founded. It's about the hard work that it takes and acknowledging that and embracing it and not trying to hide it. It's really hard to be married and be an entrepreneur. It's really hard to be a good parent and be an entrepreneur. I mean, your baby is your startup. But you know what? You have to see entrepreneurship as a journey and not a destination. It's not about winning $1 billion, although that fundamentally is a lot of people's goals. It's about living a life that you're proud to live. And you're living a life that creates things, and you're living a life that makes change. And whether that means I have a new restaurant that brings Mexican food to people who've never tasted it, or I'm creating an app that will stop people from bullying on Facebook. An entrepreneur is like a superhero of business, right? They make something from nothing. And we have to encourage that, and we have to embrace failing faster. And I think it's a great time to be an entrepreneur. When I was growing up, if I wanted to have a business, all I could do was have a lemonade stand, which, by the way, is very profitable until the police say you need a license to sell vodka. And if you sell lemonade at 25 cents and $5 for vodka, the parents and the kids are all happy.
So where can we buy your fortune cookies, Sean? Because I think that would be a really great ancillary little piece of gear to go with the book.
That would be very fun. You can get the book on Kindle and Barnes & Noble. You can get it from my publisher, FG Press. I offer mentorship over the internet for a charity, Clarity FM. I donate all my money to Camp Jordan, and I get calls once a day, twice a day. I only need 10 minutes. I'm looking at a term sheet. What's the business answer to this question? And you know what? It's a great way to leverage what little I know and at the same time help a good cause. So if you're very serious about my fortune cookie, look up clarity.fm and text Sean Wise, otherwise known as Scene Wizzy, as I was introduced once.
And Sean wasn't joking about lemonade stands getting shut down. Actually, my first business when I was 7 years old is I was taking violin lessons, and I went up to a little corner, with a cafe and played Christmas songs during Christmas season. And I was making $1 a minute until a cop shut me down for not having a business license.
Right. And you know what? And I think that's the entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that's the right place to get into it, right? The kids out there, if you're listening and you're in Canada, shovel your driveway, shovel your neighbor's driveway, get a bucket driveway, and you'll start your empire. And I don't know what you do in the U.S., but maybe a lemonade stand is a good start, or that medical marijuana seems popular. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience and to answer questions about my favorite subject, my books.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for listening to the Craftsman Founder Podcast with Lucas Carlson. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, craftsmanfounder.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a Craftsman Founder production. Join us next time for another edition of the Craftsman Founder Podcast.